So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to take the great scholarly heritage of the press, along with the dictionary and the OD&B, in some ways the greatest scholarly heritage of the press, could be argued, all those editions of Greek authors, all those editions of Latin authors, all those Hebrew texts, all that Aramaic, all that English literature, Locke, Hobbes, Hume, and so on, and to try to make those editions available in an electronic environment that's fully searchable, but that's not just fully searchable in terms of a word search, which is a fairly blunt instrument, but that's also searchable in searching that critical apparatus, for example, or that's also searchable by using these texts to examine the history of scholarly editing, or using these texts to examine how words change in their use over time, or by using complex searches to excavate the text in ways that would take, scholars who are just working with books a lifetime of individual study. Of course, any of these tools are only as good as the questions that are posed to them, only as good as the scholars who use them. But what we're really trying to do with OSEO is to make a tool that will allow students and scholars to ask kinds of questions, to interrogate texts individually and severally in ways that could never have been done before. So we're trying to take the game of textual and scholarly interpretation and take it to a new level. So some people will say, oh, sure, Henry IV, Part 1, there's that speech of what's his name when he says into the breach and he's some king or something like that. I wonder if I could find that. Well, sure, that's not very difficult. But then somebody else might say, well, is it sullied flesh or solid flesh or sallied flesh? You could find that. Somebody else might say, if we had it, I don't know that we do, the American edition of Henry James was published in 15 different editions with chapter 29 and 28 reversed. And nobody noticed. And then in 1957, I think it was, they were finally done in the right order. And then Doubleday bought the rights to the ambassadors and published it in an edition in the next year, having them reversed again. So once the problem was corrected, it kind of flipped back. Why? Because not everybody's always using the most recent edition. Well, how could you trace that textual history if you had something like OSEO? Could you find other examples if you were searching a whole corpus of edited works to see, well, what are some of the problems in the history of textual editing, in the history of interpretation, in the history of the scholarly enterprise of the university, in the history of the humanities as a whole? So this is a really important tool because it's not new editorial work per se. We're not producing new editions of 700 works, but it's still a highly critical thing that we're doing because we're making discrete and careful judgments about the best ways to present these texts to users so that they can learn as much as they can from them, so that they can interrogate them as capaciously and as thoroughly as possible, and I might add as conveniently as possible as well. But it's not just about time. It's not just about convenience. It's about taking somebody who had a pocket knife and giving her a saw. It's about taking somebody who was trying to drive a nail with the back of a screwdriver and handing her a hammer. In other words, it's a powerful tool to do kinds of scholarly jobs that require powerful interrogation. And that's really what it is. But I've given you a lot of input, a lot of literary references and questions about textual criticism, and I'm wondering whether or not you maybe have questions or thoughts, comments, or excoriations perhaps.